Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this next session, which I think will be a fascinating discussion. My name is Zia Khan. I'm the Vice President at the Rockefeller Foundation, and it's my great honor to welcome our distinguished panelists here for a conversation on coming together to support communities in times of crisis. And I'd also like to welcome our web audience, and if you are live tweeting, please use the hashtag GPF15. As we've just heard from Dr. Kim and just now in this fascinating presentation, we've made great strides as an international community in the alleviation of poverty. But as we see the averages increase, there's another story, which is what is happening to the poorest and most vulnerable. And we're seeing increasingly around the world how they are facing new problems that weren't really in existence 50 years ago. And these are both new chronic stresses like rising sea levels, or acute shocks like extreme weather events, or conflict or disease outbreaks, or often all three combined together at worst. And so we know that our current systems, which were designed in a previous era, really aren't fit to purpose anymore. And we need to rethink how it is that we help these vulnerable communities address these challenges. And at the Rockefeller Foundation, one of our big goals is to promote the concept of resilience, which we define as building the capacity of entities, either individuals or communities or cities, to prepare for disruptions, to recover from shocks and stresses, and to adapt and grow from these disruptive events. And my colleagues and I have learned through a range of our work, from an initiative on 100 resilient cities to address the problem of growing vulnerabilities from urbanization, or the Global Resilience Partnership, which we've started with USAID and the Swedish International Development Agency, to address the problem that $1 in $3 that's spent in development often is lost due to recurring crises. And we've learned that we need a new way to think about how to protect communities from these emerging crises, and also importantly, how we need to collaborate differently across sectors: academia, government, the development sector, private sector, and communities themselves. How do we come together in new ways to address the new challenges that we're facing and that we just learned about in the last session? To explore this topic, we're extremely lucky to have a panel of 4 distinguished speakers. And I'll keep my introduction short because you have the full biographies in your book. Immediately to my left, António Guterres is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Before joining UNHCR, High Commissioner Guterres spent more than 20 years in government, including serving as the Prime Minister of Portugal. Neil Kenny Geyer, on the far end, is the CEO of Mercy Corps, an international nonprofit that supports people after conflict, crisis, and natural disasters. Under his leadership, Mercy Corps has emerged as a leading international humanitarian and development organization with ongoing operations in more than 40 countries. To his right, Olara António is the president of Uganda's People's Congress and has held several UN positions, including Under-Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict and chairman of the UN Commission on Human Rights. He's also the president of the LBL Foundation for Children. And finally, Gail Smith serves as Special Assistant to the President and is the Senior Director of the National Security Council. She worked in Africa for over 20 years as a journalist, covering military, economic, and political affairs for the BBC and the Associated Press, among other news organizations. So before we begin, join me in giving a warm hand to our panelists for what will be a great discussion. So what I'd like to do is ask our panelists to share some opening thoughts and perspectives on this topic, and maybe even start with the question around, over the next 10 years, what are the kinds of crises that we have to worry about most, that will create the biggest vulnerabilities? And for those crises, what needs to change in how we respond to them in terms of how organizations come together and collaborate? Maybe High Commissioner Guterres, we could begin with you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'm not optimistic about the next 10 years in relation to crisis. I think we'll go on witnessing a multiplication of crises and a growing complexity of the crisis, both in relation to conflict and in relation to natural disasters and other related aspects. We live in a world where not only there is not a global governance system, there was never a global governance system, but power relations became unclear. And so unpredictability and impunity became the name of the game, and crises tend to emerge where they are least expected. And this is having a dramatic impact in the lives of people. For the first time since the Second World War, we have reached more than 50 million people displaced by conflict in the world. And the staggering escalation is the following. 2011, 14,000 per day. 2012, 26,000 per day. 2013, 32,000 per day, people displaced by conflict. Now, on the other hand, we see the combination of megatrends, global warming, population growth, food insecurity, water scarcity, all these things becoming more and more interlinked and having a bigger and bigger impact in a world that is also smaller and smaller. Now, the combination of these crises creates an environment in which humanitarian needs are growing in a way in which we no longer can handle them alone. So, partnership between governments, international organizations, the civil society, and business is, in my opinion, the key ingredient to allow us not to be overwhelmed by what I think will go on in the next 10 years as a very, very complex world in which more and more people will be dramatically impacted by this crisis, even if the global economy will grow, even if probably the number of absolute poor will diminish, even if many positive things will develop, even if new technologies will create a lot of opportunities for everybody. But those areas of the population that are more dramatically impacted are going to suffer, and we need to be prepared to work together to address that suffering.
Thank you. Gail?
I'd say the two big things that are coming, I think we're already seeing a lot of it, is state fragility. States that, for whatever reason, are not strong enough to withstand the kinds of shocks that occur, and then a host of transnational threats. Many of us in this room have been through the Ebola crisis, which is not yet over, but there's a great example of something. A virus does not ask for a visa. It's not confined to one country, and it is the kind of threat that necessitates a different response than some of the kinds of crises we've seen in the past. I think in looking forward, in addition to constantly improving a model which works in part, I think there are kind of 3 C's we need to think about. One is to not underestimate the complexity of these crises. I used to think 15 or 20 years ago that I was dealing with something called a complex political emergency. I don't think those compare to the kinds of things we're seeing today. So while some of the solutions are generically absolutely on point, delivering them is really, really difficult because the complexity of a range of crises where the constraints are access, literally being able to get to people, where the constraints are that you need a biosecurity level 4 gear and protocol in order to respond, are significant. So complexity is number 1. Capacity is number 2, and I think here there's a good news, bad news story we can play with. The good news is the capacity on the ground in countries that are affected has increased substantially. We've invested in that as a government. Our NGOs have invested in that, and people are also, as they do all over the world, taking matters into their own hands. So there's a tremendous capacity to build, and building that capacity is key. But we also need to build the capacity of the international system. The international system has never seen the number, scale, or complexity of crises we're dealing with now. USAID runs something called disaster assistance response teams. It's considered a pretty intense period in time where you have something between the equivalent of 1.5 to 2 darts in the field. Right now we've got 5 or 6, depending on how you count it, and we are regularly looking at where we're going to need a couple more. What that means for the government, for the international system, and for the NGO community is investing in the capacity of very, very skilled responders. The sentiment to respond is a great one. This is a discipline. You've got to be really, really skilled to run an operation in Syria. You've got to know engineering, logistics, politics, culture, development. You've got to know a whole lot of things. So investing in that capacity. And then the last thing, to build on Antonio's point, and I think many of the things that people here can contribute, is complementarity. Not everybody should do everything, but there are ways that the pieces of this jigsaw puzzle come together, whether it is the communities themselves on the ground in civil society, NGOs, domestic and international, governments, the UN and other international organizations, the private sector, figuring out what that new division of labor looks like going forward. And I'll just end with one example, which is on logistics. One of the things that has happened with greater frequency is that companies that know about logistics can offer a whole lot about how you, at scale, get something from point A to point B. So there are all sorts of ways that we can forge that complementarity, but I would say it's got to be a little bit more deliberate than we have been up to now if we're going to meet the challenges that my friend António describes.
Thanks, and we saw in Nigeria how they mobilized companies with logistics to really help with the Ebola response. I think that's a great point. Olato?
Roughly speaking, we have natural disasters and human-generated disasters. They are related, of course, but in terms of their nature as well as the response, they are also distinct. Mm-hmm. In the next 10 years, I see the worst source of crisis still remaining human-made disasters. And two factors playing predominant role here. I think horizontally, we shall continue to see the issue of identity being the main catalyst for conflict, whether it is ethnicity, sense of religious affiliation, but the horizontal dividing line will continue to be a major fault line. The second factor I see is more vertically expressed. It is the socio-economic divide. Across the globe, without exception, the gap is becoming dramatic, galloping gap, between those who have everything and more, and those who are sinking deeper and deeper into despair. So these two factors, I think, will continue to define and shape conflict in the next 10 years or so. In my view, once conflict has broken out, we have very poor capacity to handle and respond to. Internationally, much worse locally. So clearly, the emphasis has to be prevention, because we have much better intelligence in terms of prevention. We now have a much better idea what causes, we see the trends, we see the divide growing, we see all these things in open daylight. So prevention has to be the point of emphasis. Secondly, in societies, unhappily, which have already gone through conflict, but are now in the so-called post-conflict situation, it is sustainability. Mm-hmm. Some rehabilitation has taken place, a smattering of reconstruction, but not yet credible enough to be sustained. So sustainability has to be our emphasis. And then finally, I agree with António, I agree with Gail, that no single actor is well equipped to deliver on this. Not the state, because in many cases, the state is partisan, is part of the problem, is being greatly weakened, and needs to be rebuilt. Not the private sector alone is got a very important role to play, and of course the philanthropy. So it is the combination. It is getting an architecture of collaboration that works. And again, there are many examples one can give with regard to this. I think I'll stop there in terms of the initial remarks.
Thank you very much. Neil?
Well, as we can tell, this is the happy after lunch conversation as we look at the world. And I'm also tempted to say that, you know, everything that needs to be said has been said, just not everyone has said it. I don't know if I could add too much to my colleagues here. But what I would say, when I look out over the next 10 years, I would agree. I almost would evoke sort of the memory of Charles Dickens and say, I see a tale of two worlds. And that first world, so many people in this room have invested in and have helped make better. And it's encouraging and exciting. It's a world that's moving ahead. It's a world where absolute poverty's been halved over the last 30 years. It's a world where technology shows enormous promise and potential. When we just look at that potential, particularly when you think of bringing clean water, clean energy, and enough food, it's enormous. And, you know, we listen to Bill Gates, Hans Rosling, one of my favorite. I think there's a lot to be encouraged about. I think, on the other hand, there's also a tale of another world, and that is a world where we have an unprecedented confluence of complex crises, increasing fragility, a growing number of fragile states. You know, 50%, as Jim said, Jim Kim, the 50% of the world's extreme poor live in fragile states now. So we have no hope of eliminating absolute poverty if we can't make a difference in these fragile places. As António said, the most number of people, over 50 million displaced by violence at any time since World War II. Add to that just under 100 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. These are unprecedented numbers. And I guess my biggest fear is that this second world is increasing at a scale and a pace and complexity that really threatens to undermine all this good progress that we've made. And I would say that really is the challenge of our times. If the crisis is either, you know, we talk about the 3 C's, whether it's caused by contagion, climate, or conflict, you know, we have to find a way to address this rising fragility. And the reality is all of those strategies and methodologies and partnerships that enabled such progress in that first world may not be adequate in the second world. We do not have a good history of coming together as a global community in terms of fragile states. And so that is the real challenge. And I would, you know, maybe I do think there's an incredible role for the world of philanthropy and foundations. And in part, I would just encourage everyone, you know, to maybe up your risk profile a bit and focus more on these fragile states. It's great to do work in India, and India is wonderful to do, but also there are tremendous opportunities and needs now, you know, in South Sudan, Central African Republic, the DRC, Northern Nigeria, supporting those organizations that really are trying to represent an alternative and supporting local groups who are representing an alternative to Boko Haram. Those are the real challenges. And then continuing to invest in leveraging technology and innovation, because that's absolutely critical. We don't know what works in these places, and we need more technology and innovation, but in those kind of places. And then obviously what where we all need to step up is the whole issue of evidence and learning. It's absolutely critical. The last number I saw, and I hope it was a mistake, and I hope my older brain is remembering this wrongly, but it's less than 1% of foundation funding goes into research. Well, I think this research and learning is so critical for today's world.
Just a quick footnote on that. The good news on that front is that a lot of the gains we've seen in development have been because of evidence, whether it is data and evidence or evidence of success, right? The demonstration effect. In the case of fragile states or humanitarian response and resilience, tragically, but to a potentially good end, there's enough experience out there now that there is data and evidence to be had and used. And I would just echo the comment just made, marshaling that evidence, elevating that evidence, because it's been a real driver of the change I think we've seen in areas like health and food security and other areas. It's not the instinct to bring it to bear in crises and fragile states and humanitarian response, or it's not the understanding that you could really have evidence, but we actually do. We actually do, and your help and participation in furthering that would be a huge contribution.
So Gail and Neil, you've put your finger on one important bottleneck, the mobilizing evidence. And I'm curious, because in everyone's opening statements, I think there was broad convergence around what is needed. Themes like prevention, sustainability, capacity building, and an architecture for collaboration. And it feels to me like there's broad agreement on what needs to be put in place. So the question I'd like to pose now is, so what is stopping that from happening if everyone agrees to it? What are the barriers, or why is collaboration not happening? Why is evidence not being brought to bear? What do you see as, if there were some targeted points of intervention or solution, what would be most helpful in your perspective?
Well, first of all, a lot of cooperation is happening on the ground, and it's important to underline. International organizations, the civil society, even governments are working together and are working together, responding to many of these crises in a fantastic way. I mean, I would say that there are a few things that need to be changed, and they have to do with the culture with which we operate. First, traditionally, we would speak about the gap between relief and development. And there was this idea that we do humanitarian aid during a crisis, and then we start a development process to guarantee the sustainability. This is no longer possible because we have more and more protracted crises. So we need to do at the same time relief and development. We need to bring together these actors to work together since the beginning. And there you have two different cultures, indeed. And to overcome this cultural difference is, and it's very funny. It's easier to find this capacity to bring things together in the civil society than in governments. In many governments, this is dealt with by different departments, and sometimes they don't talk with each other. But many NGOs do both relief and development, and many foundations do both relief and development. So this is one of the things that I believe is essential to bring us more strongly and more effectively together. And then it's technology. The enormous opportunities that for operating in these areas, provided that we know how to do it, the enormous opportunities created by technology. I'll give you an example that in Jordan today, a Syrian refugee is registered with biometrics, with iris scanning, and the same iris scanning is used for that refugee and its family to receive a monthly allowance because of their vulnerability in the bank to guarantee that there is no fraud, but also to guarantee that there is total security in relation to infiltrations of groups and things of the sort. Which means if we are able to forget about those old humanitarian ideas that you move the trucks, you dig the wells, you bring the food, and you look into modern ways to address the needs of people and to make them participate and assume ownership in the things that are done, using technology and using more and more knowledge-based approaches, I think we will be able to multiply our capacities and our efforts.
May I just say this, that I think it is true that collaboration has improved within the United Nations institutions, between the United Nations and NGOs, between New York multilateral institution and Brussels. It's improved. What has not happened in a similar way is the application of lessons learned. We have a lot of lessons learned. There is no great evidence that we are applying the lessons which have been learned. By and large, we still wait to be jolted by a dramatic outbreak. Yep. And then we rush to where that outbreak has taken place, or where high politics is involved. We go to where high politics is involved. So by and large, we are still not having the full benefit of the volumes and volumes of the lessons learned. We need to do a lot more in that area. And we need to do more to both prevent, but also to respond to situations where no high politics is involved. Ordinary situations of intercommunal violence, ethnicity, religion, poverty. Respond more in those situations.
I think also we need to look at systemic solutions for all the right reasons. Every time there's a crisis, everybody wants to respond. And everyone that I have worked on since the invention of the cell phone, and I started in all of this when we were sending telexes and the fax machine was invented. This is something that can contribute. In every case, that's been right, but we haven't systematized that. So how do we think about getting the people who know about those applications together with the experts that know crisis response, and not just international responders, but also, importantly, people from these communities who are best suited to define the way you can get uptake, to look at systemic solutions that can either be built into the existing architecture or fashioned in such a way that they can complement. Logistics, communications, all of the technological advances that we're talking about and you are focused on have application in every one of these. But I think what happens, in part because there's a bigger response when the crisis emerges, is that the world runs at it. We throw everything at it and we don't do the systems fixes. The second gets to a point Alara made at the beginning about both prevention and staying power after the fact. It's the staying power. It's the whole spectrum. If you look at the patterns of assistance and response, in most crises, it is this thing you describe. Huge interest during the crisis, pretty big push on recovery and rehabilitation. Everybody does everything during recovery and rehabilitation. After about 18 months, people start to move on. And then 5 to 10 years later, we're all back at the same place doing the same thing because there's been a net erosion in capacity and therefore increased vulnerability. So systems fixes across the board, but staying power throughout.
Wonderful. And now, one theme that I'm picking up in the conversation is we've talked about some of what are often called top-down responses, from governments, from the UN system, from foundations and others, and then also building the capacities of communities. What do you feel is the biggest change that needs to happen in the big, quote-unquote, top-down institutions to help communities solve their problems, address their problems, and become resilient themselves?
Can I speak as a former journalist? I think part of it's the media, because I actually think communities are doing that in a lot of cases. And I think our teams and I think our partners work very hard to build that. But an untold story in the case of Ebola, for example. I'm extraordinarily proud of what the United States and our partners have done, and of the president's leadership. There is another story there, which is about Liberians, Sierra Leoneans, Guineans, which is about the African Union dispatching over 900 health workers and professionals from across the continent, of young people who formed burial teams to ensure safe burials, that doesn't come through. And I think to the extent that you all engage with media and support media doing more to tell those stories, I think we can all do more to build that capacity, but I worry sometimes that there is this notion that the world is full of passive people in crises to which we respond. And I think our finding in every single case is that there is always a community foundation upon which we can build. We can build better, but I think we've got to give visibility to that, because it changes. I don't like this word narrative. It's the new word of the year, but it changes people's conception of what is possible. And I think it's where a lot of the hope resides, because when you see people taking their future in their own hands, which I think you see in every one of these crises, that's kind of the inspiration to keep going, because there is a foundation on which to build. So
Gail, building on that point, which I completely agree with, that these communities, yes, I think that's a great point. Building on this point, which I completely agree with, that communities have a lot of capacity, what could we do differently, as government, as civil society, to help enable that capacity? Because a lot of the responses and development programs, someone ignore that capacity that's sitting there.
If I may, I think there are two words that are essential here. One is empowerment, and the other is resilience, that you mentioned in your introduction. First, empowerment. We still have, many of us working in the field, lack of respect for the capacity of those that are there. And we need to be able to work in a way that those that are there have the capacity to manage their own things, and we only support them. And this idea, to be honest, is many times absent from those that coming, especially, I mean, big UN organizations, big international NGOs, the idea that we operate better if we empower the communities to manage the programs and we support them, instead of if you manage the programs and they just benefit from what we do. And the second is indeed resilience. And I have to say, when one looks at a country like Lebanon, Lebanon has today 1/3 of its population that is Syrian or Palestinian. You visit villages in which have half of the population Lebanese and half of the population Syrian. And these communities were able to absorb it. And these communities were able to address these problems. And when we come, many of the situations have already been overcome. But there are enormous fragilities. Whatever we can do to enhance the resilience of the communities is, I think, extremely important. And that is much more to help them develop their own capacities and much less to provide assistance and to provide the kind of things that traditionally we tend to do as a first reaction to a crisis or to a situation. Empowering communities and betting on their resilience is, I think, the right way to go.
Neil, you had a hand up?
Yeah, jump in quickly. I think, three things. One is all of those from the outside as part of the relief and development system. A little more humility would help. Secondly, I think a recognition that, those impacted by a crisis, a conflict, whatever the challenge, are always the best agents of their own recovery and development, just a fundamental principle. And then third is, I think, a greater focus on local governance. I do think it is fair. I think the whole development community, relief and development community, has not done enough to bring forward principles, concepts of governance, good governance. This is why I like the resilience agenda, and Rockefeller deserves a lot of credit, for helping to enhance that conversation, because I think at the essence of resilience is good governance. It's seeing community members as citizens and finding ways to link where it's appropriate, and it's always tough to link with local government in ways that are legitimate, that promote transparency, that promote accountability. And I think we all know, and you can spend billions and billions and billions of dollars in Haiti or elsewhere, and if you don't crack the governance conundrum, you're not going to make any progress. And that's the fundamental reason we haven't seen the kind of gains that we had all hoped for. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, Jane brought that up earlier. There's been, probably billions of dollars spent over the last years in a short-term approach. At one point, we, the international community, were trucking in water to camps, $60,000 a month. There were a number of studies done, but way before, and we've now corrected ourselves. Way before, there were really opportunities. Could you put in, a local water infrastructure and system? Could you set up a governance in which the people working with local government can manage that? Well, it's been done now in a number of those camps. The price has dropped to $7,000 a month. The people, the IDPs themselves, are helping to pay for some of that. So there are opportunities to think long-term, to build local governance that I think would make a world of difference.
May I just say that if by community we partly mean sub-regional response, as for example ECOWAS in West Africa or IGAD in Eastern Africa, that has improved a lot in many parts of the world. If by community we mean the local people who are affected by the crisis, in natural disasters, yes, local communities can be exceedingly effective when organized and mobilized. We've seen that with the Ebola crisis in West Africa. But when the conflict is human-made conflict within communities, among communities, then by definition, it gets to be more difficult because the middle ground is removed, even though it exists in fragile form, but it's removed. Now, even in the midst of conflict, it's clear to me that there are two groups within society that needs to be empowered, in whom we need to invest. First and foremost, the women. it just so happens in all the conflict situations have been around the globe, under sudden massive pressure, the men tend to crumble. It's just a fact. It's a fact. But remaining standing in the middle of that mayhem will be women struggling to pull the pieces together, struggling to feed the family, improvise schooling under the trees, do whatever they can to keep life going when the men are really pretty much disappeared from the scene. So both in the midst of crisis as well as in the post-crisis situation, investing in the capacity of women is very important. The second group, the second group that we often forget are the youth.
Yeah.
Because this is the group that can be an army of spoilers of any situation if they are left to drift with no program for them, or they can help to rebuild and reorganize the society. So we can't invest enough, in my view, in these two groups, both in the midst of conflict and in the post-conflict program.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Great. Something we haven't talked that much about is the role of the private sector, and we don't actually have someone up here on stage from the private sector. I'm curious from your perspectives, everyone mentioned the need for collaboration across sectors. What are some of the unique roles that the private sector can play, and what are some of the things that they should start doing more of, and what are perhaps some things that they should stop doing that would be helpful as we think about communities in crisis as well?
I think a few things, and I think the private sector has gotten more and more engaged and more effective. I think a few things. One is, again, these systemic responses. If you look at the impact in things like deforestation and some other areas of companies that are looking all along their supply chains to see how they make changes at each point, there's a similar theory that I think applies for crisis and conflict. So that would be number one. Number two, there are capabilities that they can deliver. Again, logistics is one. In the case of Ebola, Aid and our science and technology people did a challenge on developing protective gear that is not so heavy that you can only work for 45 minutes. Well, that's ultimately going to be manufactured and made available there. So there are solutions in that regard. There's something that is always critical, which is called money. But I think there are other things to take Alaro's point about mentoring and training that the private sector can do very effectively. You look at what some of these young people and young leaders are doing, and I agree with you that they can be the spoilers. That covers up the extraordinary bright side of some of the creativity and innovation we're seeing from young people who are much more global and exposed than certainly we were. So investing in them, in a systematic way. Figure out mentoring programs where you can offer them the training they need to then go back and be more effective. The other thing is staying power. One of the things that happens in these crises oftentimes is the private sector recedes for understandable reasons. Forestalling that where possible, but making sure that there's an early return is absolutely critical, because in the post-crisis period, if there's a reliance simply on foreign assistance, it's just not going to work. So again, that staying power.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that, in the midst of conflict, I don't see a large role for the private sector. When there's war going on and absolute dislocation is difficult. But the private sector has a very important role when the guns have gone silent. Beyond immediate rehabilitation, the long-term reconstruction of society is where the private sector comes in, because you're talking about long-term investments, particularly small and medium-sized businesses. But also because, unfortunately, part of the side effect of the engagement of the UN and NGOs is a dependency syndrome that is left behind. Mm-hmm. particularly when it's been a situation of dislocation for many years. The communities, from being a proud, self-reliant communities, become dependent on the international community, on handouts from the international community. And you need more of the private sector approach to reinvigorate the sense of reliance, the sense of doing something for oneself. And of course, I agree with Gail that if indeed the women and youth are very important in this, invest, the private sector invest in the women and in the youth.
If I would like to distinguish three dimensions. First, the local private sector. Even in conflict situations, the local private sector remains active. Go to Somalia. I remember some time ago, I was in Doloado in Ethiopia in a refugee camp, and I tried to use my mobile phone, and it wouldn't work. So I went to the border with Somalia, and my mobile started working with the private companies operating inside Somalia today. The coverage in Somalia of mobile phones is better than the coverage in Ethiopia. Can you imagine that? Yeah. Somalis, I mean, the network of the distribution of money, the way they, permanently keep the economy going in this dramatic conflict situation is remarkable. So I would say wherever markets can work, it's important to support that markets work. And we can help that. For instance, instead of distributing goods, I'm more and more in favor of cash. Cash, unconditional cash to vulnerable families as a subsidy, microcredit to people to create their own businesses. And less give food, give blankets, give tents and whatever. Then, in relation to the private sector that is around here, I think there are again two dimensions. One, if we bring development and humanitarian aid together, that creates opportunities for the private sector to operate as businesses, to operate normally. And so those that manage these programs, and of course governments, both local government and donor governments are key important, international organizations, to create opportunities for as much as possible to be done since the very beginning by the normal functioning of markets is very important, and creating opportunities for the private sector. And then there is the other aspect, which is very relevant for us. A lot of corporations in their corporate social responsibility do a lot of things that are vital for our work. We have reorganized our own organization, shrinking headquarters, reducing structural costs, thanks to a private sector supporter. Our logistics has been dramatically improved with pro bono support from private sector. Registration is done in remote areas of refugees with software developed for us pro bono by, again, the private sector. New forms of energy in camps, again, the private sector supporting. And you can go on, mobile technology to distribute money to poor families. The number of opportunities for corporate social responsibility is enormous. I think the mistake is when humanitarian agencies try to go to companies to get money. Money comes from the public, comes from foundations. From companies, you shouldn't try to get money. You should try to get the kind of expertise they can provide to you. And it's very interesting. In my experience working with companies, it is a factor of mobilization of the corporate identity, the fact that people from that company are able to work with organizations like mine for specific projects, and to then that becomes an element of the identity of the company itself. So I see in corporate social responsibility a lot of opportunities that are, again, win-win situations for everybody.
There's one category of actors we should add to António's list. Because of the incidence of protracted conflict, by its very nature, it generates diaspora all over. It's Lebanon, it is Somalia, it is Sierra Leone, it is Afghanistan, it's a long list. Very strong, well-to-do diaspora. And their role, particularly in the midst of conflict, when others may be afraid to come in. This is the story of Somalia, it's the story of Lebanon. Even as the war was going on, the Lebanese abroad were pouring in money in areas where there was some relative quiet. And we see this in West Africa, we see it all over. So the role of the diaspora communities in rebuilding the old country, very important. In investing in the old country, very important. As well as, of course, in helping to also bring reconciliation, because they have not been as involved in the heat of the conflict, very important.
Neil?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up and maybe as some points of emphasis. I think the point António made is that the most important private sector is always the local private sector. And I have rarely been in a crisis or environment, even in the heat of conflict, in which it doesn't work. I mean, the reason that, sure, there's aid getting into Syria today, but if you go to the border from Turkey and the trucks that are coming across are providing, the bulk of the supplies for people. And that's true in almost every crisis that you see. Secondly, I think Olaura is exactly right, is that the role of the diaspora, particularly in terms of remittances and their own investment, there's almost $1 trillion in remittances right now going into some of the toughest environments. Let's capture that for development, and there are many efforts to do it. The third thing I would say is that I just wanted to give an example in the Philippines, and it wasn't a violent conflict, but after the last big storm, Haiyan, my own organization there, we worked with a Philippine bank, digital bank. We did all cash payments to people impacted. That was a very efficient way. It was thousands and thousands of people, but the most important thing is every one of them ended up with a bank account. So you're promoting financial inclusion through the crisis in a way that really supports long-term development and addresses one of the biggest challenges of financial access and inclusion that we face.
Can I add one more thing to the list? And I think all these points about the local private sector are about keeping markets working, because when local markets collapse, you've got an even bigger problem. But I heard an interesting story the other day about a company with a huge number of employees that invited them to do something actually about refugees. And it sent out an email and said, here are the things you can do to educate yourself. Here are the things you can do domestically to work with refugee communities in your own country. Here are the things you can do to contribute. It wasn't obligatory. But what that also does is helps build a growing constituency of people who are tracking these things, bringing ideas to the mix, and keeping the levels of attention where they need to be. So I think even moving within the workforce to keep people informed and help provide opportunities for them to respond. We've seen in the few cases where I've seen this, and I'm sure there are many more than those of which I'm aware, a tremendous outcome in terms of the immediate crisis, but also building that stable of people who may go into that field, may bring one of the tools that you suggest, and who keep this on the world's radar.
Yeah, and this is, to the point of the workforce, this is something we often see in the travel and hospitality industry.
Exactly.
Where they have the assets to help communities and a strong interest in keeping the local workforce safe and healthy as well. So lots of rich food for thought. I thought now we would turn it over to the audience and open it up for questions that people might have for the panel. We have some folks with microphones. If you could just raise your hand, and then I'll call on you. And then,
if I may suggest, not only questions,
and comments as well. Comments are welcome. I feel like comments are automatic, so I don't need to call on this. So comments, and if you have a question, if you could just keep it brief. If you want to ask it of someone specifically, please do so. Otherwise, we'll just see whoever wants to jump in. How about the gentleman right in front here?
Wait, the mic is right behind you.
This was delightful, thank you. Post-conflict, people are traumatized. There's a loss of social capital, replaced by feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, feelings of anger and hatred. To create community resilience, as you were discussing, to us, it seems, you first have to restore people and their families to function so that they can rebuild their communities. Once that happens, then individuals and families can build a resilient community. Until that happens, though, it seems to me that the cluster is the family, not the community. You can't do a sociotherapy for a whole community. It doesn't work that well. It's got to be individual by individual. I'm wondering about your feelings on this.
Well, can I just say that, you see, on the issue of building resilience and durability after conflict, there are certain things which are absolutely important. You put your finger on it. Because of the psychosocial trauma, you need to rebuild the person again, the family, the community. And that means individuals, it means individual families, it means the community as a whole. And it means also family structure, culture, the arts, what make those people whole again and give them a sense of self-confidence which they have lost, a sense of identity which they have lost, especially in the aftermath of protracted conflict. And it is equally important, in my view, that the issue of acknowledging what happened, of truth-telling, and then leading to reconciliation, you cannot dispense with that. People need to have their suffering and their experience acknowledged, even if nothing else is done after that, but acknowledged as part of the healing. And in many communities where I have been, very few things are more important for the communities than schooling. Quality education again for their children. And it can serve as a confidence-building measure even among communities in conflict. If you've got a school to which all children have access, whether you are from this side or that side, and you're given equal treatment, that engages the community and helps with the process of reconciliation, as well as generating other activities within the community. So yes, there are certain things that can be done to build sustainability in the aftermath of conflict.
Great. We had a question at the table front here. Susan?
Thank you, Zia. Susan Davis with BRAC. I thought the panel, you all had tremendous wisdom that was in nice sound bites. So it was great to hear the lineup of championing both prevention as well as staying power and listening with humility to communities and get out of this rescuer mode, changing the narrative. But what about talking about some of the roles of private sector in producing and selling the guns and the tough side of conflict, the man-made conflict, as you were saying, Laro. And since I can't resist, since you're on the panel, Gail, I mean, talk as a journalist or realpolitik, but you know, is there anything that we can and should be doing now to look with foresight? Because this community has the ability to provide very patient capital. Give us some more words of wisdom. Thanks.
If I may say something, if there are good news in the world, for me, having been in government, is that I sense governments are weaker and the civil society is stronger. And this is the kind of area, advocacy, in which the civil society has a key role to play. And this has to do with the government policy, and namely in relation to these conflicts. I mean, many governments around the world are involved in the conflicts, directly or indirectly, and advocacy for them to engage in a positive way to overcome them. And in relation to the role of the private sector, and in relation to the legislation, in relation to the way those that violate laws or norms or whatever are effectively prosecuted. I mean, there is a lot the civil society can do. And philanthropy is not only giving money. Philanthropy is also mobilizing this kind of action. I think there is a lot the civil society can do in order to put governments and to put those that act on the ground on a negative way facing their responsibilities.
António, weak government is not an unqualified good news. On the contrary, actually, too much government is bad news. Too little government is equally bad news. Because some of the difficulties we are having in so many parts of the world is that a state is no longer in a position to perform the traditional functions of a state. Yes, we do want that state to be democratic. We don't want that state to be overbearing, but it should be strong enough to perform the normal functions of a state. So yes, we don't, in civil society becoming very strong is good, but there's certain function civil society can't replace, which only the state can perform. So we want functioning, strong states, but not undemocratic and overpowering.
I don't know about wisdom, Susan, but this point is really, really key. We need capable and responsible governments in every country in the world. And I think I'm always, the glass is half full, and as dire as these crises are, I think we are seeing as many examples of the world turning around in another way. If you look at, we're looking at the Financing for Development post-2015 agenda coming up, and in the consultations we're having on those, the number of governments that are saying what they're focused on for financing for development is not so much how much aid we bring to the table, although that's important, but what they do to mobilize domestic resources. That's what all the ministers I met with last week during Bank Fund, that's what they wanted to talk about. That's huge. And that's really significant. So I think building capacity also means building the capacity of governments. A government that can gather data for all the talk about data and evidence and use that data and be transparent with that data, by the way, so citizens can then engage is a really big deal. But one of the things we found when the high-level panel that kicked off the post-2015 discussions in that is there's so many areas that we can't measure where there should be goals because a huge number of governments do not have the statistical capacity or the data to even know how many girls are in school. So those are capacities that can be, I think Bill and I would agree with Alaro absolutely on that. Another area is communications at all levels, where I think the private sector and philanthropy can play a huge role. Part of it is communications in the way the world understands what these crises are about. And there are very few of these that happened overnight because somebody waved a hand. They've all got roots in either the politics of conflict or the underlying vulnerabilities that are part of the global challenge set that we now face. There's communications on the ground. Again, looking at the Ebola crisis, the ability of communities to communicate, responders to communicate, governments to communicate, to get basic information out there. So full spectrum on communications. I think breaking down this distinction between a humanitarian response and development, I think there is none and should be none. And as António says, the minute we do that, we take resilience out of the equation. But we also run the risk of saying there's a war or there's a crisis or something that's got other deeper causes, and the humanitarians are the ones that come in and pick up the pieces. It's got to be part of the central story. The last thing isn't so much the private sector, but I think it is something that people of goodwill can do a lot about, which is about combating stigma. Obviously, we all know what impact that had on our ability to turn around the HIV/AIDS crisis. We're now finding, I was in a meeting this morning on, what we need to keep doing because the Ebola crisis is far from over. Well, one of the big challenges is the stigma that survivors carry. We have American survivors, and they're still carrying a stigma that is pretty profound. There's the stigma of young women that are raped in the midst of a conflict. Fighting that stigma, there's a stigma, I think, that comes from this notion that, again, people are passive when what you're talking about is giving them back their dignity. And how we fight that stigma, whether it's at the specific level of Ebola or countering the notion that these people are passive just because they've been hit. I'll just end this point with a great example, and this was from years ago, but I was with some colleagues who there was a crisis in their country. They were from that country. They were going to, again, have to go to the donor community. And somebody said, the donors are getting compassion fatigue. And the man in question looked at me and said, trust me, we've got beggar's fatigue. And I think it's stigma in all of its manifestations and trying to elevate dignity, even when people are in crisis, as well as all your good points about building them back, is something we all, I think, could do a much better job of.
You know, if I just address a point of Susan's question, is focused on this community here. It's no secret that the philanthropic community has not been, some have, but most have not been heavily involved in Syria. And I think that's in part because people go, how can we make a difference? And I just want to tell a story of my own organization. And if we're not the largest provider of aid in northern Syria, we're certainly one of the 2 or 3 largest providers there. In terms of cross-border. That wouldn't have happened without a family foundation grant. Early on, before ISIS, before Al-Qaeda, before al-Nusra all got in those areas, a family foundation gave Mercy Corps $200,000 and said, you know what to do with this. We then put a lot of expats inside northern Syria, set up offices from Aleppo to the north, and that enabled us to build relationships at the grassroots with all these Syrian communities. And that's the only reason that we've been able to keep up, still to today, a robust pipeline every single day that goes in because of those relationships. That was before the U.S. government could get organized, before DFID could get organized. So if it hadn't have been for your community, you wouldn't have this capacity today in northern Syria.
That's a great point.
That's such a great example of the kind of catalytic opportunities that philanthropy can drive. In the far side here, gentlemen.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Evans from UNICEF. I just wanted to say thank you to the panelists. That really reflects a lot of our experience as well. Just 2 thoughts I wanted to throw into the mix, really echoing what Gail was saying about the importance of communication and the private sector and philanthropists looking at advocacy. We're going to talk a lot during these 2 days about inequality. There's a great deal of inequality in emergency situations. That's what we find. Currently, we at UNICEF are dealing with 5 concurrent emergencies, often working with UNHCR and others. And some of them have good agents or good communications people behind them because they are everywhere and everyone feels their resonance. And then some of them have a very different trajectory. You talked a little bit about Central African Republic, a huge crisis situation there that almost nobody knows about. So I'd like to ask the panel for ideas about addressing that inequality in humanitarian responses or lack of visibility of some of the forgotten emergencies. And then another thought that I'd like to share is around innovation and the private sector, because I was very struck by our head of supply in Copenhagen, just came back from Liberia a few months ago, I think it was, and we were talking about innovation, and she was saying, you know, of course, in these emergency responses, it is that precisely at these moments that we need innovation most urgently. Yeah. Now, obviously, the private sector is where innovation happens, isn't it? So how do we get private sector innovation into some of our responses? Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, there is one thing that is very difficult to avoid. Prevention is not news, and news tend to be in a series of places and not in others. So you have fantastic coverage of what's going on in Syria and lousy coverage about what's going on in Central African Republic. And because of that, public opinions are more focused on Syria than on Central African Republic. Then governments become more focused on Syria than Central African Republic. Then, of course, Syria is also a global threat that Central African Republic, at least for the moment, is not. And so everything channels funds and support more to some crises than to others. How can we respond to that? I must tell you, it's very difficult, but I think we need a combination of instruments. First, we need a strong advocacy for humanitarian aid provided by governments and provided by foundations to be as earmarked as possible. This idea that we must have our money addressing only this activity in this community, in this crisis, which is normally what many of the donors have as a policy. We should do our best to convince donors to be as flexible as possible in the way they convey their funds. Second, our organizations need to make a big effort to reduce our structural costs. I'll just give you an example. In my organization, headquarters costs were 14% of all costs 10 years ago. They are 6.1% today. And this allows us to use a lot of the unearmarked funding that we receive, not in the structure, but in the forgotten crisis. And our Africa operations would be completely broke if we were not able to use the unearmarked money we receive in those African operations. I think the same applies to several other UN organizations and NGOs. We need to be very careful not to let bureaucracy grow. We need to be very careful not to let structures grow. We need to be very careful to make sure that, for instance, coordination, that is now the name of the game, is an added value, not a bureaucracy. I mean, we need to be very careful in order to make sure that the resources that are available for our organizations are dedicated to the people we care for, and be able with that to use our unearmarked funding to address the most forgotten crises. And at the same time, there is something in advocacy that I believe can be done. There is a lot we can do through social media, networking with other organizations to draw the attention of the people for those dramatic situations that, because they are strategically relevant, or they are far away, or they are not a threat, or for whatever other reason, tend to be forgotten. And in general, I would say, there is attention today to the Middle East. There is attention today, still some to South Asia, but dwindling. There is very little attention to most of our African crises.
Can I, just a very quick thing on innovation at the height of a crisis? That's the time it's most needed, but quite frankly, it's the time that it's the hardest to experiment. There have to be people in this room who could help convene practitioners and the private sector and philanthropists between some of these crises to say, what are the 5 areas where we could define, we could define as areas of need, and what are the kinds of innovations that might apply? It's everything from getting better at mobile money so you can get access to communications, to using mobile technology. I think we've got to use the space between crises better, because you know well from UNICEF's perspective, at the height of a crisis, experimentation is at high cost, and you need to use your experimentation to respond as opposed to invent. So use that space in between.
May I just say that it's a fact of life, I suppose is one way of putting it, that there is a lot of politics, even in humanitarian response. Politics determines a lot how the response is orchestrated, particularly at the international level. And it partly explains the unevenness of response. I remember when I was at the UN, the struggles we would have to try to get key donors to treat similar situations similarly. And we were never successful. So this is an ongoing struggle, and particularly for the taxpayers who are here, because it is the taxpayers' money who go to those situations.
Well, I regret that a big red clock and Kristen here are telling me we're out of time. Before I conclude, I'd like to ask you to remain seated, because Carol Dahl of the Lemelson Foundation and Manu Prakash of Stanford University will be joining us immediately after for a conversation about the power of invention, which is highly relevant to how we just ended this. We had a fascinating conversation. I just want to say thanks to the panelists. We heard themes around the culture of relief and development and how we need to better integrate those, the role of technology and innovation, and how the private sector can help with that, and how the private sector can help with communication. A lot of discussion around the inherent capacity of communities and how we need to respect and empower that capacity as we try and help as well. And also the critical role that women and youth play as well. And that was just among many of the insights that the panel covered. Very much appreciate your time and your thoughts, and also from the audience, the thoughtful questions that we got at the end as well. And I hope as you think about philanthropy, you can build on, Neil, your wonderful example of what a $200,000 catalytic grant was able to do. And I believe there's many of those opportunities where in the unique place that philanthropy has with flexible capital, with being able to invest, not necessarily in an emergency situation, but to think proactively and to try some experiments to help invest in knowledge and sharing learning, that these will be good food for thought as everyone here takes away some lessons of what they can do to help address this important problem. So I just want to say thank you again very much to our panelists.